What if the person you are most afraid of loving has already been living rent-free inside your dreams every single night, and your heart has already decided, without consulting you, without asking your permission, without respecting any of your very reasonable rules, that this is the one? What if the walls you built after every heartbreak, every disappointment, every morning you woke up alone and told yourself you were fine? What if those walls mean absolutely nothing against someone who doesn't climb over them, but simply grows inside them? What if the most terrifying love story isn't the one that announces itself loudly in daylight, but the one that slips quietly into your 3 a.m., that warms the inside of your chest before you even know his last name, that makes you wake up every single morning slightly furious because you cannot stop, you cannot control it, you cannot explain it. And the most honest and devastating secret is that you don't entirely want to. This is Nadia's story. This is the story of every person who has ever lain awake in the dark, heart loud in their own ears, holding a feeling they didn't ask for, and slowly, terrifyingly, courageously realizing that maybe not all intrusions are meant to be stopped. Stay with me. This one will find you. The alarm had not gone off yet. Nadia knew this because the room was still draped in that particular shade of darkness. Not midnight black, but the deep, heavy blue that arrives precisely 90 minutes before dawn. The kind of darkness that feels intentional, like the universe is still thinking, still deciding what kind of day it wants to create. She was awake. Again. She lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, her hands folded over her chest like a woman in a painting who hasn't decided yet whether she's sleeping or simply done with existing in the ordinary way. The ceiling fan moved slowly overhead, stirring the air in lazy circles, and Nadia counted the rotations the way she had trained herself to count them, methodically, deliberately, using numbers as a barrier between herself and the thought that was already pressing against the inside of her skull, like warm fingers against cold glass. He had been in her dream again. She closed her eyes tightly, then opened them, then closed them again, as though the physical repetition might shake the remnants of the dream loose from her memory, the way you shake water from your ears after swimming. It didn't work. It never worked. The dream clung to her the way certain songs cling to mornings, uninvited, lodged somewhere beneath language, humming quietly in the background of every thought she attempted to think. She didn't even know his full name. This was the part that bothered her most, the detail that made the whole situation feel clinically absurd when she examined it in daylight, with her rational mind properly engaged and all her walls standing at full attention. She knew his first name, Zane, because she had heard someone call it across a crowded room 6 weeks ago at her colleague Mira's birthday dinner. And her head had turned not because she was curious, but because something in the sound of it had snagged on something inside her, like a thread catching on a rough edge. She had looked up. He had been standing by the window, glass in hand, listening to someone else's conversation with the particular quality of attention that most people reserve for things they genuinely find interesting, rather than conversations they feel socially obligated to endure. He was tall. She registered this clinically, the way one registers weather. Dark jacket. He was smiling slightly at something the other person said, not the performed social smile that most people deploy at parties like a reflex, but something smaller and more private, like an inside joke he was having entirely with himself. He hadn't looked at her. She had looked away first anyway. She had spent the rest of the evening on the opposite side of the room, engaged in conversations she could not afterward remember the content of, and she had driven home telling herself that the brief moment by the window was exactly what it appeared to be. Nothing. A stranger at a party. A first name floating across a crowded room. The absolute, complete, unremarkable sum total of an interaction that had not technically been an interaction at all. She had been so certain. She had been catastrophically wrong. That night, he had appeared in her dream for the first time. She hadn't recognized it as significant, Dreams pulled from the debris of days the way the ocean pulls shells from a beach, randomly, without preference or meaning. She had dreamed of him the way she sometimes dreamed of people she passed in supermarkets or saw briefly on trains. She had woken, noted it with mild curiosity, and gone about her morning. The second night, he appeared again. The third. By the end of the first week, she had stopped telling herself it was random. By the end of the second week, she had developed a complicated, sophisticated, and completely ineffective system of pre-sleep mental exercises designed to redirect her subconscious toward literally any other subject: work deadlines, her mother's grocery list, the documentary she'd been meaning to watch about deep-sea creatures, anything that would give her sleeping mind something useful to do, rather than constructing elaborate, atmospheric, deeply inconvenient narratives featuring a man whose last name she didn't even know. The system failed every single night, without exception, without mercy. He messed with her every night without her permission. And the most infuriating part, the detail she circled back to every morning with fresh indignation, was that he wasn't even doing anything dramatic in these dreams. He wasn't rescuing her from disaster or making grand declarations in rain-soaked streets. He was simply there, in the way that certain people are simply there, present in the particular way that makes every other presence in a room feel slightly less real by comparison. They talked, sometimes, sat in places she half recognized, a kitchen that looked like no kitchen she had ever owned but felt completely familiar, a park bench in winter, a bookshop with too many staircases. They laughed about things she couldn't remember upon waking, only the impression of laughter remaining, warm and specific, like the memory of sunlight after you've moved into shade. And every morning she woke from these dreams with the particular emotion of someone who has been shown something beautiful in a shop window and then been informed the shop is permanently closed. She called it irritating. She called it inconvenient. She called it a psychological glitch, a neurons misfiring situation, a completely explainable phenomenon that had nothing whatsoever to do with the actual human being in question, who was, she reminded herself firmly, a stranger. She did not call it what it was. She was not ready to call it what it was. The second time she saw him was at a coffee shop. She was there first, laptop open, earphones in, working through a presentation that needed to exist by Thursday, and currently existed only as a blank slide with the cursor blinking at her with what she felt was unnecessary judgment. She had been there 40 minutes and had produced 11 words, 6 of which she'd already deleted. She felt him before she saw him. This detail embarrassed her enormously when she examined it later. She felt a shift in the air, a subtle, atmospheric thing, like the change in pressure before rain, and looked up from her screen with the unspecific feeling that something had entered the room that required her attention. Her eyes moved to the door. He was standing at the counter, ordering something. Jacket different from the night at the party, but the same quality of stillness about him. The same sense of a person who occupied his own space without apology or performance. He turned, saw her. Something crossed his face, a small recalibration, a recognition, and she realized with a plummeting sensation that he remembered her from the party. Not with the vague half-memory of someone cataloging background faces, but the clear-eyed recognition of someone who had, perhaps, also noticed. He raised a hand in a small, uncomplicated wave, the kind of gesture that contained no agenda, no demand, no expectation of response. Just acknowledgement. I see you. I remember. She raised her hand back. He smiled, that same private interior smile from the party, collected his coffee, and found a table on the other side of the room. He did not come over. He did not perform interest in any of the ways she had been trained by experience to recognize and defend against. He simply sat down with his coffee and what appeared to be a novel, and occupied himself with the complete absence of any behavior that required her to do anything about it. She stared at her blank presentation slide. Her 11 remaining words looked back at her. She typed nothing for 20 minutes. He came to the counter to refill his coffee 40 minutes later and stopped beside her table on his way back. "You've been staring at the same slide since I walked in," he said. Not accusatory, not flirtatious in any practiced way, simply observational, with the mildly amused tone of someone stating a fact about weather. She looked up. Up close, she noticed things she hadn't registered at the party. The way he stood, relaxed and unhurried, like a person who had made peace with the pace of his own existence. The quality of his eyes, which were the particular shade of dark brown that looks almost black in certain lights, and, she told herself firmly, was a completely unremarkable eye color shared by approximately half the human population. "The slide is intimidating me," she said, surprising herself with honesty. He glanced at her screen. "What's it supposed to be about?" "Market expansion strategy, 3rd quarter." "Ah," he nodded with the gravity of someone acknowledging a legitimate crisis. "No wonder it's winning." She almost smiled. She stopped it just in time. "Did you want something?" He looked at her with a directness that she noticed didn't feel aggressive, which was unusual because directness in her experience almost always announced itself as a performance of confidence, a dominance-establishing exercise. His was simply honest, as though he had looked at her and seen something worth looking at, and saw no particular reason to pretend otherwise, or to code it in strategy. "I wanted to say hello," he said. "From the party. I noticed you left early." "I had an early morning." "You noticed me too," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't arrogant. It was the same tone as the slide comment, simply factual, simply honest, with no apparent agenda attached to the honesty. The sentence landed somewhere in the center of her chest and stayed there. "I should get back to work," she said. He nodded pleasantly, as though this were a perfectly reasonable and expected response, and returned to his table without another word. She produced 47 words of her presentation in the next 20 minutes, which was the most productive she had been all morning. She told herself it was coincidence. He appeared in her dream that night with a new detail she hadn't had before, she knew, in the dreaming way of knowing things without explanation, that he had been thinking about her too. The dream didn't show this. Nobody said it. But she knew it the way you know the temperature of a room the moment you enter it, the way you know whether a silence is comfortable or unbearable within the first 3 seconds of sitting inside it. She woke up at 4 a.m. and lay in the dark for a long time. "This is ridiculous," she told the ceiling. The ceiling offered nothing useful in return. She reached for her phone, scrolled through nothing, put it down. Reached for it again, put it down again. The dream was already dissolving at the edges the way they always did, the specific words evaporating first, then the setting, until only the emotional residue remained. That particular warmth that sat in her chest like something she had swallowed that refused to be digested. She had rules. She had established them carefully after the last time, after the situation that she referred to internally only as the situation, because naming it properly would require acknowledging just how completely it had dismantled her. Rules like walls. Rules like, don't let anyone in who hasn't earned it. Rules like, your feelings are not a democracy. You get to decide what they mean and what they're allowed to do. Rules like, just because something feels inevitable doesn't mean you have to walk toward it. She had excellent rules. They were, apparently, entirely useless against a man who operated in her dreams without her consent and appeared in coffee shops with the casual, devastating honesty of someone who had not received the memo about emotional safe distances. She ran into him again 5 days later at the bookshop near her apartment. This time she saw him first. She was in the fiction section, running her fingers along spines with the unfocused pleasure of a person who has come to buy one specific book and will inevitably leave with 4, when she spotted him 2 aisles over, in what appeared to be the history section, crouched down to read the lower shelf, with the complete absence of self-consciousness of a person who has forgotten they exist in a public space. She could have moved to another section. She was aware of this option. She moved to the history section instead, with the internal explanation that she had always been meaning to read more history, which was a lie she told herself with the practiced ease of someone who had been lying to themselves for approximately 6 weeks. He looked up when she appeared at the end of his aisle, and his face did the thing it had done in the coffee shop, that small, clear-eyed recognition, that absence of performance. "History?" he said with gentle skepticism. "I have eclectic interests," she said. He stood, which brought him to his full height, which she noted clinically and then deliberately stopped noting. He was holding a book about the architecture of medieval cities. She looked at it. He looked at her looking at it. "I'm Zane," he said. "I know," she said, and then wanted to dissolve completely into the bookshop floor, because there was absolutely no graceful explanation for how she knew his name, given that they had never been formally introduced, and she had definitely not been storing it since the moment she heard it 6 weeks ago at a party where they had not spoken. He didn't look surprised. He looked, and this was somehow worse, quietly pleased. "You noticed more than I thought," he said. "I notice things," she said carefully. "It's a general habit. It doesn't mean anything." "I didn't say it meant anything." "I know you didn't. You seem like you're having a conversation with someone who isn't here," he observed pleasantly. She closed her mouth, reopened it. "I'm Nadia." "I know," he said, with exactly the same inflection she had used, and the corner of his mouth lifted in a way that was completely unfair, and she would be noting a formal objection to it internally for the rest of the evening. They stood in the history aisle for 40 minutes. She did not buy any history books. She bought 2 novels, both of which he had mentioned, and she stood outside the bookshop afterward in the autumn air with her bag of books and the sensation of someone who has been in a minor earthquake. Everything looks exactly the same as it did before, but you are acutely, uncomfortably aware that the ground is not as fixed as you had assumed. He messaged her that night. She didn't know how he had her number until she remembered, with a sensation like stepping off a curb unexpectedly, that she had given it to him. Outside the bookshop, when he'd asked. She had given it to him with the complete composure of a woman who made perfectly rational decisions and was absolutely in control of herself and her choices. The message said, "The history section was a creative approach." She stared at it for 3 minutes. She typed, "I told you, eclectic interests." He replied immediately, "Sure." She put the phone down, picked it up, put it down. The single word, "sure," was doing something unreasonable in her chest, taking up more space than a 4-letter word had any legitimate right to occupy. She went to sleep telling herself firmly that the conversation was nothing, that the bookshop was nothing, that 6 weeks of dreams were a neurological inconvenience and not a message from any part of herself worth listening to, and that tomorrow she would wake up with her walls fully intact and her rules firmly in place and her heart in exactly the orderly, protected state she had worked so hard to maintain. He appeared in her dream 40 minutes into sleep. This time he was laughing at something she'd said, properly laughing, the kind that reaches eyes and slightly ruins faces, and is therefore the most genuine, and therefore the most dangerous version. And dreaming Nadia, unburdened by all of waking Nadia's excellent and necessary rules, was laughing too. She woke at 3 a.m. She lay in the dark. She could still hear the echo of the laugh. This has to stop, she thought. But she lay there in the blue pre-dawn darkness and felt the warmth in her chest that his presence in her dreams always left behind. Like sunlight on fabric, the warmth outlasting the source. And she thought about outside a bookshop in autumn air, and a message that said, "sure," with the weight of something much larger than 4 letters. And she thought about how her heart, despite everything, despite every instruction she had given it, had not once during any of these encounters behaved like a heart that wanted this to stop. He messes with me every night without my permission, she thought. And then, in the dark, in the honest hour when defenses finally sleep, even if their owner cannot, she thought the thought she had been avoiding for 6 weeks with the diligence of someone walking around a very deep hole. What if I don't want him to stop? The ceiling fan turned slowly. The room breathed. Outside, the city was quiet in the way it gets just before dawn, that held-breath silence before the world remembers it has somewhere to be. Nadia lay in her dark room and held the thought very carefully, the way you hold something fragile, not crushing it, not throwing it away, just holding it and feeling its weight and learning the shape of it in your hands. She picked up her phone. She opened his message. She typed, "You appear in my dreams every night. I didn't invite you, and I can't make you leave, and I thought you should know that it's extremely inconvenient." She stared at it for 4 full minutes. She sent it. She put the phone face down on the mattress and stared at the ceiling with the particular feeling of someone who has jumped from a very high place and is currently suspended in the moment before discovering whether there is water below or ground. Her phone lit up. She turned it over. His reply said, "You appear in mine, too. I should have told you at the bookshop. I've been trying to figure out how." Nadia read it twice. Then she read it again. The warmth in her chest expanded, quietly, without announcement, without drama, like a room filling slowly with light. She didn't reply immediately. She lay in the dark and breathed, and let the feeling be what it was, without immediately categorizing it or defending against it, or building a wall around it, which was, for her, the most courageous thing she had done in years. Outside, the first birds began. Somewhere in the city, morning was deciding to begin. She typed finally, "Tell me in person. Coffee shop. Thursday." She put the phone down. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 6 weeks, when she fell back to sleep, she didn't dream of him. She didn't need to. He was already there, in the space between sleep and waking, in the warm and truthful dark, in the most honest hour. Not as an intruder anymore, not as something unauthorized and inexplicable and inconvenient. Just as Zane. Just as the person her heart had apparently decided upon 6 weeks ago in a crowded room, when a name floated across the air and something inside her, something ancient and embarrassingly perceptive, had turned toward the sound of it like a plant turning toward warmth. Permission, she thought, as sleep took her gently. Maybe some things don't ask for permission. Maybe some things simply know. This story lives in the most honest and terrifying corner of human emotional experience, the space where we lose control of our own hearts and spend enormous energy pretending otherwise. Nadia's journey is not simply a romance. It is a portrait of a woman slowly, reluctantly, courageously surrendering the exhausting labor of emotional self-protection to something she cannot explain, control, or deny. The nights that felt like intrusions were never violations. They were her own heart speaking in the only hour it was allowed to speak freely. The most powerful love stories don't begin with permission. They begin with recognition. The soul-deep, irrational, completely inconvenient recognition of someone your entire being insists upon, regardless of what your very sensible and well-constructed rules have to say about it. Nadia's Thursday coffee, her 3 a.m. message, her final quiet surrender in the dark. These are not defeats. They are the bravest moments of her story, because choosing to stop running, choosing to hold something fragile without immediately protecting yourself from it, choosing to say, "I see you, and I'm terrified, and I'm here anyway." That is not weakness. That is the whole point. That is everything.